Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume.
And I'm Scott McCandless. It is the week of July 17th, and this is your Monday briefing. As you know, we're keeping a close watch on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 developments, as well as FY24 appropriations. Congress has 2 weeks to take action before a scheduled August recess, and then very little time in September to complete a spending bill before the federal fiscal year ends on September 30th to avoid a possible government shutdown. The House Appropriations Committee has approved spending legislation which reduces IRS funding and eliminates U.S. funding for the OECD. The Senate Appropriations Committee approved legislation that would leave IRS funding unchanged, and this week, the Senate is scheduled to consider its version of a bill that includes OECD funding. Today and tomorrow, the G20 finance ministers will meet in India. And coming up on Wednesday, July 19th, the House Ways and Means Tax Subcommittee holds an international tax hearing to discuss the administration's handling of the global tax negotiations. Both public and private officials, including Michael Plowgen, Treasury's lead negotiator at the OECD, are expected to testify, offering key insights into not only the business community's concerns, but also a chance to hear from top U.S. officials about their views on U.S. international tax policy. Also on Wednesday, the OECD will hold a webcast to provide an update on its international tax work. More events and details are included in the description of this episode. Sindhu?
Thanks, Scott. I want to let our viewers know quickly that a number of documents related to today's episode are included in the description of this episode, as is PwC's Pillar 2 Country Tracker. And now I'm so pleased to be joined by Will Morris for the second Monday in a row to talk about what else but Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Thanks, Will, for being here.
Are you tired of me yet?
Not yet, not yet. You're always welcome. So let's start with a question that I feel like I ask almost every day of my life. What happened?
Right. Well, that's a great question, particularly today. So as we talked about last week, we were expecting action from the inclusive framework. We got an outcome statement, which we can discuss very briefly. But this morning, at least US time, we had the release of a substantial number of documents relating both to Pillar 2 and to Pillar 1. And this represents a huge amount of work that the OECD has been doing over the past several months now, and on a number of key issues for businesses. So it's quite a big deal. Can I pretend that we've totally digested, well, that much in the past 2 hours? No. So we'll come back and talk about that. But you know, in terms of sort of drawing some threads out, we can already tell some things.
Well, understanding that not all has been digested yet, could we start with Pillar 2 and maybe give us what you see as some highlights so far?
Right. So there are, a number of things that we've been looking at, and we talked about a few of them last week. We now have more clarity on the so-called UTPR safe harbor. So this is the undertax profit rule, and this is an exemption for a further year, so into and through 2025, in relation to the ultimate parent entity jurisdiction, where there is a statutory tax rate of 20% or more. Now, it's not completely sort of laser focused on the US, but it's pretty focused on the US. So clearly this is an attempt to remove some of the political pressure around the UTPR, at least for another year. Put slightly differently, you could say, despite, they were saying a year ago, we're not going to do this, can't do this at all. They've done it, and that might mean that some of the pressure that has been applied, particularly by the Ways and Means Committee, has had some effect. Okay. So that's one of the things we see. There's been a lot of discussion, as you know, about the treatment of credits, particularly as it relates to domestic income. One of the issues has been around transferable credits. These are the types of credits that appear in the Inflation Reduction Act and elsewhere. It does appear from the documents which have been released that the OECD believes that it's reached a solution on this, which essentially allows transferable credits to be treated in the same way as refundable credits. We'll obviously have to consider more of the details of that and see how much it holds up. But that is quite a big issue that they think they've moved along politically. We get more details on the QDMTT, the Qualified Domestic Minimum Top-Up Tax, safe harbor, and there are some useful things in there. All of this is, a little mixed, honestly, as far as businesses are concerned, to a certain extent as far as countries are concerned as well. Because one of the things we see in the QDMTT safe harbor, despite the fact that they try to, on the whole, make it as consistent as they can do, even though they pull it in from some of the broader definitions of the QDMTT, they do also say that in certain cases, certain countries can use local accounting standards to be required in the QDMTT, and that is going to make this more complex, to be sure. There is also stuff in there on substance-based income exclusion. There's stuff in there on FX aspects of this. And there is also the STTR, the subject to tax rule, not the language itself, but an explanation of what countries, of what people can expect to see when this is opened for signing later on in the year, in a couple of months' time. And I think this is of great importance to developing countries. This is part of trying to keep the developing countries inside the tent. On the other hand, exactly how much it actually affects transactions, countries, remains to be seen.
So let's turn to the global information return. We understand there has been some development on that. So fill us in.
Well, again, it's a mixed bag. So one of the things that, as you know, it's a potentially very complex information return, requiring a huge amount of information of a type which has previously not been collected, far less reported. And one of the big asks that businesses had is, this calculation for the effective tax rate is done at a jurisdictional level. So can't the reporting be done at a jurisdictional level? Because as businesses know, most of the collection of that information is actually done not at a legal entity level, but a business unit level, at a country level. And there has been some movement towards that in this document. It allows for essentially a transitional period of 5 years where most of the information can be reported at a simplified jurisdictional level. But there are two things about that. The first, that is not exclusively at the jurisdictional level, so there will still be some information which is required to be collected and reported on a constituent entity by constituent entity level reporting thing. That's a tongue twister, which I have to practice every day. So there will be some of that detailed reporting, but also it does say in very clear language, this will probably not be extended. Right. How much comfort does that give businesses? If this is something which is going to require a huge ERP transformation to collect this information in 5 years' time, is this something you actually really need to start doing now so that the safe harbor doesn't give you a great deal of protection? We don't know. We'll find that out, and that'll be for businesses to try to do. But changing an ERP is not a simple thing.
So while we understand there was also a Pillar 1 document specifically on Amount B, can you tell us some of the highlights from that one as well?
Right. So Amount B is the sort of set return on routine marketing and distribution functions, and this is has always been one of the potential, some would say few, potential benefits of Pillar 1 to many businesses, because this would go beyond Amount A. Okay. Obviously there have been disagreements between countries as to whether that should be a high return, should it be a low return. This puts out for comment essentially a pricing structure, a matrix. There are considerations which are also built in, or will be considered around local comparables, for example. There are two types of methodologies that they're consulting on. We'll have to see how it goes. This is a consultation. It is at least a consultation, which is open until the beginning of September, and then they'll make a decision after that. But I think it's really important for businesses to actually to consider this, to think about it, and to make recommendations, to make suggestions, because this will actually travel separately from Pillar 1 Amount A, which, as we've discussed before, will have difficulty potentially getting ratified, all the rest of that stuff. This would be inserted into the transfer pricing guidelines. So there could be some benefits for business from this. I would also note that the fact it's been put out for consultation, obviously that's nice for business, it does also indicate that there is not complete agreement, which is not a complete surprise either. So, I think worth watching.
Okay, and finally, to wrap this up, what are companies to do in the meantime?
Happy reading. The answer is start to try to digest this. But if I were doing a sales pitch, I'd say watch Policy on Demand again shortly.
Excellent. And on that note, Will, you are coming back for a much more in-depth episode that we will have out shortly. So thank you for that, and thank you for this.
You are very welcome.
And for our viewers, in case you missed it, included in the email with this episode is the latest Week in Review with Janice Mays. And remember to tune in later this week for another Week in Review.
And whether or not you were in lockstep with every move of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, you'll want to watch our interview with Wade Sutton about the Moore v. United States case, which challenges the constitutionality of a Section 965 international reform transition tax. A big deal then and now. Thank you as always for watching, and stay with Policy on Demand for the latest developments in Washington and around the world. Take care.